Hi, I'm Toni Williams, and this is Brooklyn Savvy. Hi, I'm Toni Williams, and welcome to Brooklyn Savvy. We are delighted to have Terri Givens as our guest. Dr. Terri Givens is our guest on this episode of Brooklyn Savvy. And you might say, so what makes Terri Givens special? Well, she lives in Menlo Park, California, and typically we focus on people that are Brooklynites, but we also focus on the beyond. So we're so happy to have you here to wrap up our season that we've looked at systemic racism, how to dismantle systemic racism. So I figured let's do a show on empathy. And you've written this fantastic book on radical empathy. But before we dive in, let me introduce our savvy panelistas. We have PHYLLIS WHITE-THORNE, Dr. TOBIE STEIN, Jennifer Jones Austin, and Dr. Maria DeLongoria. So, Terri, talk to us about radical empathy. What does it mean to be radically empathetic?
Well, it starts, of course, with empathy, which is, of course, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. But the reason I decided to go with radical empathy is because it's not enough to have empathy. I mean, it's not enough for me to step into somebody else's shoes and, okay, I can understand they're having difficulties in life, whatever. Radical empathy takes us that next step and says, what am I going to do about it? What kind of action am I going to take? And, I realized this was something important for me because, I have concerns about structural racism and discrimination and so on. But I really knew that I needed to take that next step to take action and to make myself vulnerable so that people understand what it means to have empathy, but also to take that next step.
I love the radical piece because I also think of radical forgiveness and I think of radical transparency and how all of that combines into something that can be really beautiful. So to kick off this discussion, if you could talk to us, one thing I noticed, and I really related to what you talked about when you talked about what it meant to be a respectable Negro back when we were called Negroes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and of course, I was born in 1964, so the term Negro was the term we used at the time.
That was the polite term.
That exactly, indeed. And so I started this journey by trying to understand, why did my parents, decide to end up in Spokane, Washington, a place where it's less than 1% Black, especially when I was born. And then, also on top of that, my dad was in the military until I was about 7. And we really only interacted with other Black families that were from the military. And we didn't really interact with other people in Spokane who maybe went to the Baptist church. And because we were Catholic, I'm the youngest of 7. I was raised Catholic. And so I was really trying to understand why did they make the choices they did? Because, in some ways I was angry about the fact that we didn't have those connections and even connections to our family members in places like Los Angeles, and my dad is from Pittsburgh and my mom is from Louisiana. And so for me, it was a way to really try to understand what were some of the things driving them. And that idea of respectability came to me, and that, we always had to look a certain way and talk a certain way. And frankly, that, that respectable Negro is the one who's assimilated. And, I think my parents realized that being assimilated was going to help us later in life and, to be part of white society.
Do you think we're ever really assimilated? Because I related very much to your book because of that drive that parents had back in those days. Can we assimilate?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by assimilation. Can I talk a certain way? Can I act a certain way? Can I dress a certain way? Absolutely. But, that the society is not set up for us, no matter what we do. And the day I realized that, well, there are many days I realized that. But, I just remember hearing this story on NPR talking about how Black women, regardless of how wealthy they are, how much education they have, we still have poor maternal and fetal health outcomes. And I was just like, wait, I'm educated, I have enough money to live on, why shouldn't I have better health outcomes? And I realized that there's certain things about structural racism that just don't change.
Now, you talk about vulnerability. Explain how, in what context when you speak about being vulnerable.
Vulnerability really is a part of empathy. So for me, I wanted to model how people can empathize with me because I'm telling you my story. I'm opening myself up. I'm digging into the deep, dark recesses of my life to figure out what's going on. But it's also, you don't have to, tell that whole story. Really, it's more about being able to understand yourself. So for me, that first step of being vulnerable was being vulnerable to myself and being willing to say, this is something I really have to deal with.
Yeah, I think too, you grew up in Spokane, Washington, which is a place that has very few African Americans. In fact, I remember a trip that my sister and I took, and we stopped at an IHOP in Spokane. We called it Spokane,
Spokane.
And this waiter said to us, he says, a bunch of blacks just walked into the restaurant. And we were like, did he just say a bunch of blacks just walked into the restaurant? But it turned out, and then a woman behind us overheard the conversation, and she decided, this is a white woman, to kind of apologize for his discomfort with us. So talk to us a little bit about growing up in Spokane.
Well, first of all, I have to say I grew up Black and Catholic in Spokane. So, there's only one other Black family in our church. And so, Spokane, you just, every Black, even though we didn't go to the same church and my parents didn't interact necessarily on a social level with these people, you knew all the other Black people in Spokane. It's like you'd wave to each other on the street and so on. But, Spokane is in Eastern Washington. It's better known for kind of the outdoors and unfortunately, if you go to places like Northern Idaho, the far right extremists, but it did have that military base. And so a lot of Black people who settled in Spokane came from that military base or, there's other reasons to be in Spokane, obviously. But, Spokane, you just kind of knew that as a Black person, you were going to stand out. And so you had to adapt to that. And you had to just assume people were going to make comments. And you just had to assume that people were going to be uncomfortable around you. And so I feel like I grew up in this environment where I was always kind of braced for the fact that people were going to question who I was and why I was where I was and all these different things. And, it's funny because, today we call it these things microaggressions, but, at the time that was just life.
Now, Toby, you have a point that you wanted to make.
Yeah, I see that you use the metaphor that white supremacy is the ocean.
Right.
We are the fish swimming in it. And in the story that you tell, can you please talk a little bit about this metaphor and how this metaphor influenced your life? Yeah,
so I think one of the reasons I use that metaphor is because we tend to think that, as I've gotten older, maybe now we're finally getting to a point where people are getting past racism, especially after Obama was elected. Maybe we're finally at least getting closer to being post-racial. But, it's like, my neighbors don't, they don't seem to be racist particularly. But I realized, and the reason I talk about the sea of white supremacy is we're all stuck in it, right?
Yeah. Yes.
We all live in it. And so we don't realize it. It's like breathing the air. And it's kind of like what I was saying before. It's like we just accept it and it's the norm. And so I realized the only way we're going to understand and move past this is to understand that we all are living in structures like segregation and, the fact that, it's hard to get a job, and it's not because we aren't capable. It's because we live in the sea of white supremacy that says that we are not the norm, right? And so every single one of us, even, my white husband lives in the sea of white supremacy. So we all have to understand that and that we have internalized it. We're breathing it in constantly. And if we aren't intentional, then, I think that's part of the reason why my parents, looked down on other Black people because they were part of that sea of white supremacy. And it's like, okay, well, if we're going to be better than, we can't be with these other Black people who, we don't think are as good.
And when you speak about internalized oppression, I mean, that is so key because it is so very subtle. You know, the messages that come across when you see a group of young Black men and how people sometimes hold their bags and that kind of thing. Talk about the internalized oppression and how it is, I think, very toxic to people of color.
It's incredibly toxic. I mean,
very toxic.
Because imagine, and I talk about my 20s as my years of cognitive dissonance, because I felt like, okay, I'm Black, but Black is bad, therefore am I bad? But I know I'm not bad. It's like you have these things going around in your head. And so, yeah, it's incredibly toxic because, especially with the fact that my parents, kind of kept us away from other Black people and so on, it made me think, well, what's wrong with them? That's, because I'm just like them. But also the internalized oppression causes us to question ourselves. It causes us to, it's funny because I tell people I don't like that term imposter syndrome. It's not imposter syndrome. People are beating us up for being Black. It's not that we're imposters. We may have all the qualifications in the world, but people are still looking at our color and saying, oh, you can't possibly be, so well-spoken and articulate and all of that.
Maria, what are you thinking? What are you thinking? I see you over there. I want to hear your point.
Okay, so, Terri, as you were talking about this imposter syndrome and this idea of internalizing the racism. I kept thinking, and, when Black women in particular, right, we often fall under this imposter syndrome, for lack of a better term, right, for your discussion. But we have taken what you've talked about, right, and we've internalized it so deeply in ourselves that we don't need white folks to tell us that we're not good enough.
That's right.
We're telling ourselves that we're not good enough or I don't belong there with the credentials that would outmatch almost anybody. But we still tend to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody was telling me that they were watching the Mahalia Jackson documentary and how she had imposter syndrome and didn't feel like she belonged in Carnegie Hall. And I'm just like, how is that possible? This incredibly talented singer, and she felt like she didn't belong. But that's the kind of thing, that's what happens is, because we're told, but it's not just that we're told, everything in our society, is geared against us. So, yeah.
You know what, though? I'm thinking about your experience and how mine mirrors yours in some respects, with the exception of the fact that in my in middle school, I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, which was very Black. And we moved to white Easton, Massachusetts, right during the Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud movement and the whole Black Panther Party and all of that. So I think that gave me more of I'm going to prove to you, which is still an issue, but I'm going to prove to you that I can do what you can do even better than you can do it. That's kind of where I think I landed in this. Jennifer, I see that you've been nodding. What would you like to contribute?
How much of this is racism? How much of this is sexism and misogyny? And is it, this radical empathy for me, as I listen to her, extends well beyond racism.
Yes.
And it's not that everything is just race-based. And so that's what I think I'm grappling with in this moment, where I'm trying to figure out, okay, I'm supposed to be listening for the racism element, but just, Mahalia Jackson being in Carnegie, that could also be about just being a woman who, as women being marginalized in our society and being, just seen as less than capable. So I'm just trying to figure out, is it overall radical empathy just for one another and, how our experiences inform how we show up? The foster child, the individual who grows up homeless, the child whose parent has mental health issues, the child who grows up with a parent who doesn't love him or her or they, how that then affects how they move through the world and the importance of showing radical empathy for that person. That's what I'm sitting with right now.
Yeah, and I think that's an absolutely important point, because but the reason I focus on race is because that's where my breakthrough came, right?
Absolutely.
And, it's because, the gender component is extremely important too. We talk about intersectionality, but Black women are always the ones who are, like I said about the maternal health story, and just the fact that my father was a Black man made him more susceptible to heart disease. Just that fact, There were so many things that revolved around race, and gender is important too, because of course, as Black women, we know, this is something that we deal with all the time, but so I don't want to say that it's not about all these other things. And I think radical empathy is for all of those different issues. But for me personally, I had to grapple with that issue of race, because January 6th wasn't about women necessarily. It was about keeping Black people from voting. It was, and all of these different things that are happening around the country are really focused, and not just on Black people, it's on brown people and anybody who's not, falling in line.
So your audience, you were directing this to a white audience in terms of being empathetic with us, or were you talking to all of us in terms of how to be empathetic?
To all of us, because we have to learn empathy for ourselves. Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right? I mean, we have to understand that we have this internalized oppression that we are, suffering from in many ways, and that in order to understand the broader picture, we have to understand this for ourselves, that we are impacted by living in the sea of white supremacy. So if we don't acknowledge that, it's too easy to beat up on ourselves.
Now, you also talked about the path too. You talked about a path. You mentioned empathy, vulnerable, grounded, open. You talked about how can we get there. Can you describe that to our viewers?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, it was a 6-step path, and I talk about the 6 steps to radical empathy. And the first is that willingness to be vulnerable, and the second is being grounded in who you are. The third step is being open to the experience of others. And so that's an important step, because we have to make sure that once you kind of get grounded in who you are, then you can be more open to other people's experiences. And the next step is practicing empathy. Empathy is something that we have to practice on a regular basis. And I use myself as a model for understanding that. And then the step number 5 is taking action. And step 6 is creating change and building trust.
Thank you so much for that. Toby, you were going to say something.
I wanted to ask you to talk about the ability to dare greatly in terms of being vulnerable. I love that. And how do you dare greatly?
That daring greatly is that idea that, just going to Stanford University. I mean, my God, the first generation college goer, that was daring greatly.
Yes.
And, to be so, I've always been a competitive athlete, at least until more recently, to dare to do things, to travel abroad, to become a professor, all those things for me were daring greatly.
How much is that connected to perhaps the concept that your parents were instilling about being a respectable Negro?
Absolutely. I think that has so much to do with it, because again, I was trying hard to prove that I was worthy, to prove, and it's not just in the fact that I was trying to do all these things. It was that, I was trying to do them in a particular way. Right. And so, it's funny because, my parents come from a generation that, wasn't necessarily out marching in the streets, although now I do a lot of that kind of activism. So it wasn't to go out and be an activist. It was to go to school and get good grades and get a good job. And, there were all these things that you had to do to be respectable, and, buy a nice house, all those different things. And so, yeah. the American dream, absolutely.
And to be a credit to your race. How's that one?
Yes.
Credit to the race. But it's true. Jennifer, you wanted to say something.
I'm fascinated by all of this, and I'm really leaning in. I'm really appreciating your story and your experience. And I think what's really gripping me is we're not many years apart, but I grew up in the home of a civil rights leader and an activist. And so the doing well in school was not because you had to prove you were better than somebody else. It was just what you did. It was like, this is who you are. Like, it was kind of like Black excellence without having to say what Black excellence looked like. Like in my household, in my family, we often talk about it wasn't, I am third generation graduate school educated. It wasn't a conversation about where you went to school. It was just, what are you going to study? And you could study whatever you wanted to. You didn't have to be a physician or a lawyer. You didn't have to be an educator, whatever you wanted to study and explore. There were expectations placed upon you, but it wasn't because you were trying to meet some white standard. It was just, you were purposed in life and you had a responsibility to make the most of your life.
Absolutely. And I agree. I completely agree with what you're saying, but I kind of walked in both worlds because I also understand what you're saying, Terri, because when you're in it's different when you're in a white school and you go back to a diverse neighborhood. But when you're in a white school and you're going back to a completely white neighborhood, it is different. It's a little different. But
I went to a Black church.
We didn't have that either.
Right. And I had a Black, very strong family.
Right, exactly. So Phyllis, you wanted to get in there. I don't think I've given you a chance to get in.
Well, yes, I wanted to ask, I really love the way that you took empathy and you really used your family and your experience to really show us, how empathy does work beyond it. So when we were talking about the sea of racism that we're all in, and I just thought about how empathy, we usually think about it as something that we sit in somebody else's space and try and understand where they are. And I just think about us. I work with a lot of people that want to be allies and that are allies. And they constantly question, so what do I do? What is the next step for me? And so when I was reading your book around empathy and radical empathy, it came to me, you need to somehow try to learn as much as you can, try and sit in the shoes of those that you want to be allies to. And then it just becomes natural. And I loved just reading your book because that showed up for me. But then again, there's so many of us that are conflicted by all of the messages that we get. And so the other side of that is being able to sit in our own shoes. How many of us stop and think about, I need to sit in my own shoes? You might think about trying to understand somebody else, but sit in your own space and question what you're feeling, why you're feeling it, questioning those fears that you have, those things that get in your way. So in that way, your book was just amazing for me, and I'm still reading it. I'm almost finished. The thing that I might want to ask you about is the health disparities. We're talking now about all of those people that are afraid to be vaccinated. So how does empathy show up there? How does that show up for us?
Well, first of all, we have to understand why people don't want to get vaccinated or they're afraid of getting vaccinated. And, it's funny, people talk, and I think in the book, I even mentioned the Tuskegee experiment and so on. But that's not really the reason. It's more about the fact that when I went to see the doctor about my, the pain I was having, he the first time I went, the doctor just dismissed it. And the second doctor I went to just dismissed it. And finally, I found a doctor who, and that doctor, a white doctor, told me, oh, I bet all these doctors told you that you couldn't have endometriosis. And I was like, well, yeah. and I did have endometriosis. And that's why I was in so much pain. So, it's really interesting that, especially with the health disparities, that we just have to fight for ourselves, right? And so the empathy there is really important, not only to understand that, we're dealing with these kinds of health disparities, but that we're not crazy. That we have to understand that we're in a system that doesn't acknowledge our pain, that doesn't acknowledge that we have issues with things like heart and heart disease and stroke, that there's so many aspects of that.
And we're going to have to wrap shortly because we're going to go into our two-part episode in this. But I just wanted to really express some appreciation for your being vulnerable. Because so often when we talk from our heart and we speak about what it feels like growing up to be African American, we're taking a huge risk. Mm-hmm. We could be attacked for our viewpoint. We can be retaliated against. We can be misunderstood. And then we can create alienation when what we're trying to do is to create understanding. So I just want to thank you so much for daring to do the book, opening up your life, and just helping us to all unpack and learn from it. So it's been a great episode of Brooklyn Savvy. Viewers, tune in to the two-part episode of Radical Empathy, and we'll see you next time on Brooklyn Savvy.